Hello, and welcome to the Why podcast from London Business School, where we dive deep into the big questions shaping our work and our world. And of course, we ask, why? Many organizations invest heavily in gender diversity initiatives. They introduce new policies, new programs, new targets, all designed to close persistent gender gaps at work. And yet, these initiatives often face resistance, not just from those who openly oppose them, but sometimes from people who say they care about equality. So why does support for diversity initiatives so often fall short? To explore this, I am joined by Elinor Flynn, Assistant Professor of Organisational Behaviour at London Business School and author of Constraints, Competencies, or Choices, How Lay Theories of the Gender Gap Impact Diversity Support. Hi, Elinor. It's great to have you here today for the Why podcast.
Hi, Katie. Thanks for having me.
So first, Elinor, I want to ask you about why explanations matter more than attitudes. We often assume that people's views on diversity initiatives are driven by their politics, their ideology, or their own position in the organization. But your research suggests something else is going on. You argue that people's support for gender diversity initiatives depends on how they explain the gender gap itself. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean? You talk in your research about lay theories. This really sets the tone for your research. Can you tell me what that means and how it relates to the gender gap?
Yeah, so the focus of my paper is understanding people's lay theories for the gender gap. Lay theories are everyday sense-making strategies that individuals use to try and make sense of the world around them. So we form lay theories about all sorts of things, from, to what extent people's behavior is nature versus nurture, to what extent people believe that you can change the intelligence you have versus it's something that's fixed. So to help make sense of the world around us, people are acting kind of like naïve scientists and trying to kind of make sense of the underlying causes to explain why things are the way they are. And what I argue is that people are also doing this to make sense of inequality in organizations. And I focus on gender inequality. So the idea is that when people see that gender gaps continue to persist today, in spite of the fact that women are do really well educationally, in spite of the fact that there's a huge plethora of diversity initiatives, yet they still remain underrepresented, people are forming explanations to make sense of why that is. So that's what I mean by gender gap lay theories.
So we're going to break that down and it's going to be really helpful. But yes, thank you for explaining that. And I just want to ask you also, why do explanations matter so much when it comes to supporting diversity initiatives?
Yeah, so I feel that explanations matter because most of the research thus far has focused on that, as you alluded in the intro, that if people don't support diversity initiatives, it's either because I don't think people like me are going to benefit from them, so a kind of self-interest explanation, or they don't align with my values or my ideology. Ideology tends to be your kind of values and ideals about how things in society ought to be approached. And in the context of diversity, it's a value around how much do I think equality needs to be pursued as a goal versus maintaining the status quo, for example. And so while undoubtedly those play a really important role, what I'm trying to contribute and to speak to is that it's not those alone. So it's possible that people might hold a value of supporting equality or thinking that fairness is very important to pursue in organizations, but they might not support diversity initiatives nevertheless, because what's implied by the diversity initiative about what the underlying cause is, diversity initiatives are in effect solutions that the organization is coming up with for the problem of, for example, women's underrepresentation. Lay theories are individuals' diagnoses of what they think the problem actually is.
So basically everyone's opinion.
It's their opinion. And if that misaligns, so what you're telling me this diversity initiative is intended to do doesn't align with what I believe the actual core of the problem here is, then I may not support diversity initiatives, even though in general, I do support fairness or equality. It's just not, I don't believe this is the route that's actually going to get us there, or who's responsible for actually making the change.
Thank you for that explanation. I want to ask you, why did you think this was an important missing piece in the existing research on diversity support?
Yeah, so I thought it was an important missing piece for a couple of reasons. One is that evidence in other areas on lay theories suggests that lay theories are changeable. So tend to be informed by observation and experience, and thus they can be influenced. So relatively more so than something like changing someone's value system or ideology, there's evidence that lay theories are changeable over time. And so therefore, this might be an area that organizations can intervene on to move the needle on diversity support relatively more potentially than things like the sense of self-interest people have or their ideological values. Another reason is that I suspected that for some of the reasons I explained about the current state of gender inequality, there's reasons to suspect that organizations themselves are likely key environments in which these lay theories are getting formed or reinforced over time. Again, because for many people, the first 20, 25 years of their life, they see men and women achieving very similar amounts at school. Again, there's some evidence that women actually are outpace men in some areas. So it seems like men and women seem to be pretty equally accomplished and competent. And yet, when we get into organizations and the further up people kind of proceed in their careers, that's really where these gender gaps tend to emerge. So it's very likely that there's something going on in organizational cultures that is kind of shaping the implicit sense making that people are forming about why these gaps persist. And so also important to understand for that reason as well.
Okay. That's really interesting. I want to ask you about the three stories people tell about the gender gap. In your research, you identify three dominant explanations that everyone uses to make sense of, that some people use to make sense of why women are underrepresented at senior levels. Mm-hmm. And this is something we talk about a lot here at London Business School. But one focuses on organizational barriers, mm-hmm. and one on women's traits or competencies, and one on women's personal choices. Mm-hmm. So at first glance, these explanations can all sound reasonable. Mm-hmm. But I want to ask you, what are these three lay theories and how common are they in everyday thinking?
Yes. So to first identify this, given in the literature, we hadn't kind of explored what are the full range of lay explanations that people make for why the gender gap persists. I both asked hundreds of employees and also read reader comments on newspaper articles about gender inequality, where people are reacting to what they've read about the kind of journalistic perspective on why gender inequality exists. And I coded the kind of reasons and explanations people gave, and they tended to fall into these three main explanations, as you alluded to. One, the belief that, the reason why women remain underrepresented in leadership or powerful positions is because primarily they are still facing discrimination and bias. Second explanation was rooted in men and women's traits. So this belief that men and women have inherently different traits on average, and the traits that are rewarded in terms of for leadership and positions of power tend to be those that align with men. And then the third explanation, which was, I felt, the most novel in terms of prior research, doesn't really suggest necessarily that this is a distinctly different explanation, but yet it very much in the way people were talking about it emerged as such, which is it's not necessarily that women don't have the traits or the competencies required for leadership or to be in positions of power, but simply they have different priorities and are making different personal choices. So I found that although it's not that people might only endorse one and reject wholly the other. But when I asked people, do you see as one of these having playing more of a role relative to others, or do you think they're all kind of equally valid? People tended to endorse one explanation, as I think on average it was accounting for close to 60% of the reason why the gender gap persists, which suggests that although people may think to varying degrees all are true, most people tend to think one seems to take up or account for more of the explanation relative to others. And in terms of prevalence, I found that the barriers explanation does tend to be endorsed most.
So people like to blame the organization.
So the idea that bias or discrimination is kind of a primary driver, that did emerge most commonly. But then followed by that was this personal choice explanation was endorsed next, and by roughly 28% of the comments reflected that. And then these dispositional factor trait-based explanation, either about things like assertiveness or competence directly, emerged closer to 20% of the time. So all fairly frequent, but barriers followed by choices, followed by traits. Now, I also feel like I need to caveat and say, the data for this study were collected in between 2021 and 2023, but beyond the scope of this discussion, but very much in line with my theory that people's sense-making about diversity and diversity initiatives and how much we should be supporting them has evolved in the last couple of years. And so it's possible that those base rates of how much people endorse the lay explanations might be different if I were gathering that data today.
I was going to ask you, given everything going on right now, things have changed, haven't they? Maybe there's a bit of a different way of thinking or a backlash.
Definitely. And that is, again, kind of consistent with why I thought a lay theory perspective was important, because we're seeing that even with people in the same political affiliations, in relatively short periods of time, opinion polls from how people felt in 2021 about diversity initiatives, how people feel along the same party lines in 2025, there are some noticeable shifts. And so it's not that people necessarily have fundamentally changed the parties that they're identifying with or their ideology, and yet some underlying sense-making about, how necessary or important are these initiatives, because what are really the causes of why inequalities are persisting. I think there's reason to suspect that those narratives are evolving, potentially more than people's core underlying value.
I want to move on to responsibility and control and why choice changes everything. And one of the key insights from your work, your research, is that these explanations don't just describe the problem, they shape who people think is responsible for fixing it. In particular, explanations based on personal choice seem to have a uniquely strong effect. And so if you can explain, why does framing the gender gap as a matter of choice change how people respond to diversity initiatives?
Yeah, so this gets at why I think that kind of one of the core contributions from this work is around why understanding the way people think about personal choice is so important. Because so if we step back to thinking about implementing diversity initiatives, and diversity initiatives vary widely, of course, but some of the most common ones are the ones that people tend to call to mind tend to be these more structural initiatives that imply that bias or discrimination is kind of at the root of why inequalities exist that need to be rectified. So, for example, unconscious bias training is one of the most common types of diversity initiatives. Unconscious bias training implies that the organization, there's something fundamentally unfair about the way decisions are made, and we need to train that bias. It's the responsibility of the organization to train it out of employees or managers.
Which, side note, but we're talking about that a lot with AI right now, with conversations I'm having, and how they're trying to train AI to help with the bias.
To reinforce bias, exactly. And so implicit is that there's a responsibility is on the organization for why inequalities persist and to do something about it. What I found when I looked at what differentiates these three lay theories, which, as you said, kind of on their face, all might sound to varying degrees plausible, what really differentiates them are what they imply about what we call the locus of where the issue resides and how controllable is the issue. So what I mean by that is, does this explanation imply the source of the problem is something internal to women themselves or something external in the environment? And how controllable is that thing by women themselves? So for a barriers explanation, intuitively, if you believe it's about bias or discrimination, this implies the source of the problem is not residing in women themselves. It's something in the organizational or external environment. And therefore, this implies that women don't have much control over this at all. I can't control what some external force is kind of acting upon me. A trait explanation and a choice explanation both imply, I found, that people believe it's something internal about women themselves, so something about their traits or something about their preferences. So those two explanations are similar. But what I found differentiated them was the degree of how much control women have over the problem. And relative to choices, people do not see traits as personally controllable as when you frame inequality as a function of choice. A choice, by definition, implies that at least two courses of action are being evaluated, and then one path is taken. Mm-hmm. So necessarily, that seems to imply a degree of agency or intentionality that is greater than how confident I am, how assertive I am. People vary on this, but people are less likely to believe that we really can intentionally or have within us the ability to fundamentally change our personality or fundamentally change, how risk averse, for example, or how good at math we are. Right. Whereas when you frame it as choice, it seems to be personally controllable because it seems intentional. And therefore, both how internal something seems and how controllable it seems jointly affect how much responsibility we blame or put on people for the outcomes that they have. And so taken together, what I then find is that this choice explanation is the most undermining to diversity support because it makes women seem most responsible for the inequalities that continue because they seem most controllable.
So I want to talk to you a little bit, too, about why gender is different from race. Mm-hmm. One of the striking findings in your research is that people are more likely to explain gender gaps in terms of personal choice than racial gaps. Mm-hmm. So that suggests that not all inequalities are understood in the same way. So why are gender gaps especially likely to be framed as the result of choice?
Yeah, this was also a really interesting finding I felt from the paper, which is, and kind of tapping or kind of extending from what we were just discussing, to try and kind of see, is there really anything different about lay theories compared to ideology? If there's something unique about lay theories tend to be context specific, which means that we form a lay explanation about in a certain environment or for a certain domain or situation that doesn't necessarily blanketly hold true in a global sense. Whereas ideologies tend to be these more kind of global values that we're applying to the way we think about social inequality broadly defined. So if there's something distinct about the explanations people are forming about the gender gap that might differ from how they form an explanation about other forms of inequality, we might expect then these explanations might be differentially endorsed when you ask people, well, why do racial gaps persist? Mm-hmm. And indeed, that's what I found. So in one study, I randomly assigned people to think about and kind of read statistics about racial gaps in career attainment versus gender gaps. So just kind of replacing whether it's gender or race is the focus, and then to endorse whether or not people think the reasons for why these continue have to do with barriers, have to do with traits or competence, or have to do with choices. And what I found is that people are significantly more likely to endorse a choice explanation when they're focused on gender relative to when they're focused on race. And importantly, when I talk about choices, there are two categories of choices that that emerge. One is choices about work and family. So to what extent people believe women are prioritizing caregiving or the motherhood role over the work role or employee role. But then there's also another category of choice that emerges just as frequently, which is beliefs about the type of work that women are interested in pursuing. So we can think about this as, for example, women's underrepresentation in STEM fields. Mm-hmm. The idea that, well, women are just less interested in pursuing careers in engineering or science. They are more interested in careers that are more social or involve helping. And so it's a personal preference of the type of work that you want to do. We don't even have to talk about children at all. It's purely about the occupations and what the kind of job tasks are. So I found that for both of those choices, people are much less likely to, when you ask them, why do racial gaps persist? People are much less likely to see it as a function of one of those choices.
Sure.
Unfortunately, in terms of these internal-based explanations, I did find that people are more likely to say they think racial gaps are due to differences in education or competence relative to gender gaps. So it suggests that to the extent that people are making these internal explanations, they're relatively more likely to see gender gaps as a function of preference and choice, and relatively more likely to see internal explanations about race, less about choice, more about something that has to do with education or ability. Importantly, I should say both are very likely to endorse a barriers explanation also for both. I didn't see strong differences in how much people think. People think that women and racial minorities continue to face barriers as well.
But I was going to ask you, yes, how does this complicate the idea of a one-size-fits-all approach to diversity initiatives? Surely this does complicate it.
Yes. So I think one of the, kind of critiques or limitations that I feel like both practically how diversity is talked about in organizations and also to some extent in the research is that all types of underrepresented groups tend to be bucketed in kind of one general category where we talk about marginalized groups or underrepresented groups and implement diversity initiatives and believe that it's this sort of one size fits all, that all of these initiatives should be equally beneficial or supported depending upon whomever the underrepresented target is. And what my research suggests is that that's not in fact the case, in that if people believe that the underlying reasons why women remain underrepresented in leadership are different from the underlying reasons why racial minorities continue to be underrepresented in leadership, that suggests the implied solutions that people are going to support and the extent to which people support solutions often predicts how successful they will be, is likely to be different as well. And so I think this has implications for thinking about within the diversity world, there might be certain initiatives that people would support more if the understood target is more about racial gaps, or if the understood target is more about gender gaps. So as an example, one of the types of initiatives that I've also done research on is fertility benefits. So increasingly, some organizations have been offering coverage for IVF or for egg freezing even. So egg freezing coverage that's an initiative that makes it easier for women to delay or put off having a family into the future. And what my research suggests is that the more people think this is about choice or women making different preferences, they might be more likely to support that type of initiative. But when people think about racial gaps, obviously a fertility benefit isn't necessarily going to have any relevance for that.
Okay.
Conversely, if people think that it's more about that there are cultures that are not very inclusive to people from different racial backgrounds, and we want to promote a diversity ideology that celebrates different, religious holidays or broadens the kind of spectrum of the types of the way people present professionally that's more inclusive of a broader types of racial identities. That doesn't necessarily align with if you believe it's for women, it's about choice and preference. So it's all about kind of understanding that people may support these initiatives depending upon who the target group in mind is, and does it align with what they believe about why those groups continue to face underrepresentation.
Okay. And I guess lastly, I want to touch on why this matters for organizations and leaders. These findings have important implications for organizations, obviously, and leaders who really want diversity initiatives to succeed will be the first to say that they're working on this within their company or organization. But your research suggests that resistance isn't always about opposition to equality, but about disagreement over what the problem actually is, which you've touched a lot on already. What should organizations take away from your research?
Yeah. So one of the things that I hope organizations will take away from my research is that I would encourage them to take a hard look at the way that they and their managers the language they use to talk about reasons why some people come into the organization or leave the organization, who does well at the organization and why, and look at both the language that's used to describe that, as well as other cultural norms or practices in the organization, and consider whether some of those, however well-intentioned, may be unintentionally reinforcing certain explanations and sense-making about why we are seeing the gender gap persist the way that it is. So more specifically, as an example, oftentimes, so if we take one of the kind of groups of industries or organizations where women remain most underrepresented are fields like financial services and consulting, sometimes called industries that have very kind of greedy organizational cultures where they require employees to be always on, always available, and ability and kind of working around the clock and put in very long hours and have very little control over their schedule. When leaders who run these types of organizations talk about this, you might hear them say things like, or when recruiters, when they're recruiting people in the organization, they might say things like, you know, this lifestyle isn't for everyone. You really have to really want it. Mm-hmm. Or they might say things like, early on in your career, you have to say yes to every opportunity and it'll pay off later. You'll be able to have more balance later on. Now, on the face of this, gender isn't mentioned at all. It doesn't even necessarily sound particularly biased. But what comments like that, what do they imply? They imply that you have to really want it. So that implies that to the extent that some people, and maybe women in particular, leave the organization after a period of time, the explanation is, I guess they just didn't really want it enough, as opposed to, we as an organization have designed work and our expectations in ways that disproportionately impact women or other particular groups. On the second example I gave about, you know, balance will come later. You really need to kind of just put in really long hours and say yes to every opportunity early on, but it'll pay off later. That assumes everyone can equally defer work-life balance or the other demands that might be infringing on your time to an equal extent, not taking into account the fact that, of course, women, for biological reasons, having a biological clock, if you want children, you can't just indefinitely kind of put off those decisions about whether you're going to start a family to the extent that men are able to. And at the same time, it also assumes you might have a partner at home who helps pick up that slack while you're saying yes to every opportunity. Right. And what we know is that while women's roles have expanded quite a lot in terms of the different hats they wear, where some women are really prioritizing their career and or also continue to prioritize household or caregiving responsibilities, men's roles have not expanded quite as much. And so those men that are able to defer, put off balance, may be more likely to have, heterosexual men at least, a female partner at home that is making their household run in ways that makes them able to make that choice.
Right.
So this language implies that these are gender neutral, when in fact it doesn't account for the fact that they actually differentially impact people in very unequal genders and unequal ways. And so I think it's interrogating that sort of language, and whether intentional or not, is it implying that a failure to do so is a function of individual preference or priority, as opposed to something that is actually not controllable or more systemic, or something that we at the organization have designed around and could make a different design choice to operate differently.
And it begs the question, have you seen any financial companies, Wall Street or here in the city, that have made changes that actually have done something positive about this? Or is it too early to say? Or
So I would say not yet anything directly connected to my research, but what I would say, since the paper's come out, but what I would say is that what we saw during COVID and the shift around greater embrace, and in fact, the kind of full-scale shift to remote work that we saw as in a social experiment was a very interesting testing ground. Whereas before, getting flexibility and working from home, requesting working from home was an individual accommodation that, again, people tended to associate that with women, and that women request or need more flexibility. And that often incurred or came with career penalties as a signal of, well, you're not as serious about your career and you're choosing to prioritize kind of work-life balance. Once we saw everyone had to adapt to working remotely, we found that one, many organizations actually worked quite well remotely. And two, it was something that actually men and women really valued. It turns out it's not just something that women want. It's something that all employees of all genders really seem to embrace.
So perhaps it gave men a chance to actually, where they weren't able to speak out and say, I also want this. Now they can.
Yes.
And they can be more part of the caretaking at home and doing all the things that the women typically
And it's not just even about caretaking or personal life demands. It's also, many people will talk about, I'm much more efficient by not having to commute an hour in and lose 2 hours a day when I'm on the tube. And then I'm stressed and I get into the office and I'm not in a great mood and therefore I'm a little bit short with my colleagues. Right. So there's actual real productivity and performance even reasons why greater flexibility, if not fully remote, at least a hybrid model, actually can be a win-win for both. So we've seen some organizations in financial services and other related industries walk those back somewhat, which I'm sorry to see, because I do think that was a cultural shift that really benefited women, but it need not be just for diversity reasons. It's something that widely benefits employee well-being across the board. One other thing I just will note is that I really like Corinne Lowe at Wharton has talked about reframing the need for flexibility in these overwork cultures or domain or industries or highly demanding industries and organizations, as instead of calling it flexibility, let's call it predictability. Flexibility can have this connotation of potentially being a little bit wishy-washy or not. Yeah, exactly. Or not totally committed. Right. Predictability implies you may still expect me to work really long hours, and I'm even willing to do that. I just want to be able to predict when and where those hours are happening. Sure. And so she highlights great work that has been done on looking at how medical professions, and especially nursing, have become much more gender balanced. And indeed, nursing is predominantly female-based. But it's also a field that requires often long hours. When nurses work 12-hour shifts, they work long hours. Why does it work for women? Because the hours are predictable. Right. So again, getting away from this notion that women don't want to work as many hours or choose to have greater work-life balance in a way that creates a connotation of they're not as motivated or ambitious. It's rather about needing greater predictability on when those hours are going to take place.
So this is exactly my shift. I can build my life around that, and it just works much better.
Yeah. So I think that one thing I would encourage organizations to do is to try and think more creatively about, can we design our teams and workflow structures potentially inspired by this medical model more, where you have a team and maybe one person is on call for a weekend and other people know that they're not, and that rotates. Right. So, different organizations are going to have different constraints that are going to make different things possible, but just trying to think more creatively in that way.
So that brings, I used to work in a newsroom, and it's very much that model as well, which worked because 2 months ahead which weekend you're going to be working, or, when you can't make plans. And hadn't thought about that in a different type of organization, but you're right. The predictability would be key for so many people, especially those with other obligations at home. And it's a really good idea. Thank you for that advice. I hope people listen to you and do research. So our signature question at the end, I wanted to ask you, Elinor, what one practical change leaders can make to ensure diversity initiatives are seen as necessary, fair, and worth supporting?
Yeah. So I think given in light of our discussion today, and especially around how this lay explanation around personal choice is especially undermining to gender initiatives, I would encourage leaders to look at the language they and their other managers or supervisors use to talk about, for example, when people leave the organization, how is that discussed? And is it discussed in ways that somewhat unintentionally imply this is something about preference or motivation, as opposed to that implies a free choice or a personal preference is being pursued, versus there's something cultural or structural around our incentives that being more honest about acknowledging differentially impacts women relative to men.
So being more open and honest about
and just it seems very subtle, but these framings around language can really shift the attributions that people are making from seeming something as a choice or a preference to actually a response to a constraint.
Elinor, thank you so much for this really important and interesting discussion and for sharing all your very thorough and detailed research with us. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks so much, Katie. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you for joining us for the Why podcast. We'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you usually hear gender inequality explained at work? And do those explanations shape how you feel about diversity initiatives? Drop us a comment on Spotify or YouTube and join the conversation using hashtag the Why podcast. And don't forget to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. For more ideas and insights from London Business School faculty and beyond, visit london.edu/think.